Good evening. My name is Jeff Hawks. I'm the Director of Education and Veterans Outreach for the Army Heritage Center Foundation. I'm standing in for Mike Perry tonight, who couldn't be with us, and I'm pleased to see you all here for this evening's program. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest lecturer, J.W. Bell. He maintains the Boston 1775 website, sharing history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about the start of the American Revolution in New England. He grew up in Massachusetts during the bicentennial, infecting him with curiosity for the untold stories of the Revolutionary War. Tonight, as we approach the anniversary of the start of the war on April 19th, John will explore exactly why the Redcoats marched to Concord 248 years ago. And without any further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, and to Mike, and everybody at the Army Heritage Center Foundation for having me. This talk is based on my book, The Road to Concord. It discusses the 8 months that led up to the start of the Revolutionary War in New England. And tonight I'll speak in particular about the perspective of the British Army general who saw that war coming and tried to stop it, General Thomas Gage. In the late summer and fall of 1774, almost all of New England fell out of the control of the British Empire. Most New Englanders still thought of themselves as fundamentally British, but as part of being British, they saw themselves also as standing up for the fundamentals of the British Constitution, and that meant defying what they saw as a corrupt government in London. The British government had appointed General Thomas Gage to be the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America, and starting in May 1774, to be the royal governor of Massachusetts. And this talk focuses on the position of General Thomas Gage in 1774 and 1775, the difficult position he found himself in, the increasingly untenable position, the ultimately impossible position. Gage had served in North America for many years, and he was back home in Britain in early 1774 as Parliament debated how to respond to the Boston Tea Party. And he personally promised King George III and Prime Minister Lord North that he would enforce Parliament's tough new laws on Massachusetts. And he tried. Gage helped the Customs Office and the Royal Navy close Boston Harbor to ships from outside the colony. He stationed Army regiments in the center of Boston to keep the peace. He moved the legislature north of Boston to Salem. In August 1774, Gage started to implement the new Massachusetts Government Act, which just arrived from Parliament, by swearing in a new council made up of gentlemen appointed from London instead of elected in Massachusetts to help make the laws in the colony. But crowds intimidated a lot of the new council members into refusing their seats, and they also kept the county courts from meeting out in the countryside. Gage tried to shut down a Salem town meeting protesting that new law, but the town met anyway, even with troops nearby. And Gage decided that Salem was just as bad as Boston, so he might as well move back to the town where he had more soldiers. On the 1st of September, 1774, Gage ordered a couple hundred of those soldiers to go to the gunpowder storehouse in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and collect all the powder inside. He also had a squad go into Cambridge, another neighboring town, to take possession of 2 small cannon assigned to a militia company there. Gage thought those acts would strengthen his position by ensuring that nobody could get the idea of using that gunpowder and those cannon against the king's troops. But the general's actions triggered an uprising the next day, and thousands of New England militiamen mobilized. By the end of the day, more council members had resigned, and it was clear that the authority of the British government stopped at the state gates of Boston. General Gage could not enforce royal laws anywhere in Massachusetts unless he had troops nearby. Now, at that time, Boston was a peninsula connected to the mainland by a neck that was very narrow at high tide. The town was easily defended from the land, which is why English settlers had chosen it in the first place back in 1630. But by 1774, all the town's defenses were designed to protect it from attack by sea, particularly from the French Navy. As of September 3rd, 1774, Gage was back to the position of the earliest English settlers, worrying about how to defend the Boston Peninsula from the mainland. Between the Royal Navy and his men at Castle William, which was the major fort, the harbor was safe, but the countryside was hostile. Fortunately for Gage, he had a contingent of the King's Army, including the Royal Artillery. And on September 3rd, a Boston man named Thomas Newell recorded in his diary, 4 large field pieces were dragged from the common by the soldiery and placed at the only entrance to this town by land on that narrow Boston neck. To the people in the countryside, that looked like the royal government was taking away their militia cannon and their gunpowder and deploying regular army cannon against them. So they began to collect cannon themselves. The result was an arms race, as I call it, between the military authorities and the British resistance. The goal of that race was racing to get the cannon, the artillery, the mortars, and particularly the field pieces, which were cannon designed for use in battle. Field pieces mounted on carriages and equipped with the available ordnance, with the rammers, the worms, the swabs, and other things you needed to fire them. They were the most advanced battlefield weapons of the time. Unlike muskets, they had no peacetime use. They were unquestionably weapons of war, and that's what both sides were now racing for. There were many cannon in places around Boston in the summer of 1774. Most were in shore batteries on Castle Island or other islands, pointing out at those feared French naval ships. Each side feared the other was preparing for war, so they wanted to keep weapons away from the other side. And it's very easy to move from that rationale to building up your own side's military power by taking as many cannon as you could get. There were lots of cannon in the batteries built around the shores of Boston Harbor. The Charlestown Battery, north of Boston, contained 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning that they could fire balls weighing 18 pounds. In the first week of September, people in Charlestown began to move the ammunition away from that battery. General Gage heard about this. He sent an officer over on September 7th to investigate. Then he sent a larger force. And here's how the Boston merchant John Andrews described the result. About midnight, another formidable expedition was set on foot. The boats from all the men of war were manned with soldiers with orders to dismantle the fort and bring off all the ordnance, stores, etc. But when those soldiers arrived, they found the battery was empty. The locals had removed all of the cannon out of reach of Gage's army. 5 days later, the cannon guarding the mouth of a river in Dorchester, south of Boston, also disappeared. That same day, September 12th, Governor Gage received a protest from a committee representing the Suffolk County Convention. County conventions were a way to get around provisions of the Massachusetts Government Act. The country delegates asked why their king's army was pointing cannon at them. And Gage assured those visitors that he deployed artillery to protect citizens. And then he added his own accusatory question. What is the reason that the cannon were removed from Charlestown? Both sides already knew the answers to those questions, which was that both sides were preparing for war. There were also cannon inside Boston. 2 large batteries overlooked the main harbor. In 1770, they contained 22 artillery pieces between them. The Royal Artillery had taken over the South Battery, but the North Battery was still under militia control. On Wednesday, September 14th, sailors from the Royal Navy entered the North Battery from the water and spiked all the guns inside. In addition, the Boston Post-Boy newspaper reported, the cannon in the batteries back of Governor's Island were removed by the general's order. So the Royal Navy was thus keeping the shipping channel safe for its warships and keeping those cannon out of the hands of troublemakers. Now, cannon from batteries were old and were heavy. They weren't on easily maneuverable carriages. For battles, a provincial army would need field pieces, cannon light enough to mount on carriages and moved with teams of horses and men. And the best field pieces were made of brass. Boston's militia had 4 brass cannon belonging to the town's artillery company or train, and they were stored in 2 brick armories or gun houses in the town's south end. These were small guns, even by the standard of field pieces of the time. Some sources identify the older pair as 2-pounders, meaning that they could fire cannonballs weighing only 2 pounds. The other pair were 3-pounders, ordered specially from London, and they had arrived in February 1768. The town had paid for a new gun house beside the common to store those new guns in. And the man in charge of the militia artillery regiment, Major Adno Paddock, well, he had been born in England. So he was feeling more loyal towards the crown. He had signed an address welcoming General Gage to Massachusetts as the new governor, showing his support for the crown. But the other officers and most of the men in the artillery company were strong Whigs. On September 5th, 1774, the Boston Militia Artillery Company met and basically fell apart. Gage didn't want Paddock to lose control of his company's 4 field pieces, so he ordered a double guard to the new and old gun houses. But on September 15th, the morning after the Royal Navy dealt with the North Battery and Governor's Island, people found a hole in the side of the town's older gun house, and the 2 brass cannons stored inside were missing. Naturally, General Gage put an even stronger guard in front of the new gun house, and that site already seemed quite secure. It was right next to the Boston Common, where the 4th Regiment of Foot was camped. The gun house itself also looked secure. The door from the street was both guarded and locked, and Admiral Paddock had the only key. But even that situation didn't seem secure enough to Gage and his commanders. Royal Artillery officers went to Paddock to take the gunhouse key and move the cannon into their camp. On Friday, September 16th, a squad from the Royal Artillery came to remove those cannon, but the gunhouse was empty. All 4 brass field pieces that had belonged to the Boston train were now gone, out of General Gage's reach. Those were the last publicly owned cannon in Boston that the British Army had not already taken control of. On the day of the second theft, General Gage and his officers then turned their attention to the cannon from Boston that remained in private hands. Some sea captains and merchants owned cannons so that they could arm their ships during wars. Some hardware merchants had guns in stock. On September 16th, the Royal Artillery demanded that a merchant named Arnold Wells sell them all the cannon he had stored beside his shop. And the army didn't wait for him to deliver. A squad came and took all those guns. According to another merchant, Wells being out, his wife, who you know has a very voluble tongue, went out and rallied them so that the officer was necessitated to give her a receipt. 11 days later, the Royal Artillery made a deal with a hardware merchant named Joseph Scott to buy all the shot and other ordnance he had in his store. The selectmen and the Committee of Correspondence of Boston came the next day to protest. So did the Boston crowd, and those people were far more angry and vocal than the town officials. Scott tried to cancel the sale, but the British artillery commander, Colonel Samuel Cleveland, came personally and said he had it in his orders from the generals to take the remainder and have them they must at all events. Scott locked his cellar door, but the Royal Artillery returned with a carpenter, broke open the cellar door, and were constantly employed in carrying out shot, etc., till nearly sunset. That night, someone smeared Scott's front door with the contents of the town's outhouses. Not content with disfiguring the outside of his shop, a merchant wrote, the vandals, using a ladder, opened his chamber window and emptied several buckets full into it. General Gage's frustration about this situation reportedly boiled over that night in a meeting with Dr. Joseph Warren. The doctor asked, "What is the meaning that the general buys military stores?" And Gage reportedly replied, "The country people who are all armed and collecting cannon and military stores from all quarters, which could indicate nothing but their intention of attacking His Majesty's forces. That it is notorious that many cannon have been conveyed, notwithstanding the works from thence, and arms carried out openly by every man that goes out of Boston without molestation." Gage was right to be alarmed. This calendar lists all the major military developments in and around Boston in September 1774. The blue stars indicate when the provincial resistance gained control of cannon, and the red stars indicate when the Royal Military did. By the numbers, Gage came out of it ahead. He had started with more artillery pieces, and he had probably kept more than the Patriots managed to smuggle away. But having any artillery would make the Massachusetts Patriots more dangerous and more bold, and as I said before, collecting artillery was preparation for war. Ever since the powder alarm on the 2nd, General Gage had taken steps to strengthen his military position. On September 4th, he had summoned the 10th and 52nd Regiments to Boston from Quebec. The next day, he told his second-in-command in New York to start moving all the troops from that city north to Boston. General Gage also tried to alert his superiors in London to the situation. On September 12th, he wrote to the Secretary of State for North America, Lord Dartmouth, "The country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunition in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good or bad." On September 25th, the general wrote to his other boss, the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, "Affairs here are worse than even at the time of the Stamp Act. I don't mean in Boston, for throughout the country. The New England provinces, except part of New Hampshire, are, I may say, in arms, and the question is not now whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for a civil war. The whole country, from here to New York, armed, training, and providing military stores." General Gage told his superiors that the British government should suspend the Massachusetts Government Act and other new coercive laws until they could develop a plan and assemble enough force to really enforce those laws. Now, one thing General Gage did not tell the government in London was that Patriots had snuck out those 4 brass field pieces from gun houses right under the noses of his own sentries in a town his soldiers were patrolling. Telling London about those stolen brass cannon might just have been too embarrassing. The general may have been hoping to get those back before anyone in London had to know. Now, by early October, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress convened in Salem. This was a large group of men elected in direct defiance of the Massachusetts Government Act to form a shadow government and organize resistance against the Crown. Gage didn't know that on October 25th, a Congress committee drew up a budget for an army with an artillery force, but he could certainly guess that was happening. In December 1774, the arms race spread outside of Massachusetts to the neighboring colonies. On December 8th, the Rhode Island Assembly voted to remove almost all the guns from Fort George off Newport. And the Rhode Island governor very frankly told the captain of the Royal Navy that the Patriots had stripped the Newport fort of guns to prevent their falling into the hands of the king. 5 days later, the people of New London, Connecticut moved their cannon into the country. People started to wonder about New Hampshire, where Fort William and Mary guarded Portsmouth Harbor with cannon. Bostonians saw signs that the Royal Navy was about to send a ship north, and the next day, Paul Revere rode 60 miles on icy roads to warn the New Hampshire Patriots. Militiamen stormed Fort William and Mary, overwhelming the captain and nearly 6 soldiers inside, and they seized most of the gunpowder in the storehouse. 2 days later, New Hampshire's 2 delegates to the First Continental Congress, John Sullivan and Nathaniel Folsom, led militia units back to the fort to take out the cannon and the rest of the ammunition. General Gage received a report from the captain in charge of the fort that he had shot 3 4-pounders at the militiamen, but nobody was killed or hurt. If there had been any deaths up at Fort William and Mary, we would probably say that the Revolutionary War began in Portsmouth in December 1774. And we would also have to say that the aggressors in that fight were not the British regulars marching into Concord, but Patriots attacking a heavily outnumbered British outpost to seize weaponry, which would be a very different story. After the loss of Fort William and Mary, Governor John Wentworth of New Hampshire was basically powerless. As for Connecticut and Rhode Island, those colonies still elected their governors, and those officials who answered to the people and not to London were already less than enthusiastic about supporting the Crown's new laws. Finally, just to make life even worse for General Gage, it was clear from the letters he was receiving from London that the government there was not going to send him any more resources. He was largely on his own. All his warnings they had seen simply as alarmism, and they lost confidence in his judgment. But Gage didn't give up. He started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts and to ferret out where they were hiding their cannon. On February 21st, 1775, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress's Committee of Safety and Supplies decided they had control of enough cannon to start organizing artillery companies. That was also the first meeting attended by Dr. Benjamin Church of Boston, a leading Patriot organizer. In fact, Church was so high level that Dr. Joseph Warren had consulted with him, and only him, before advising Samuel Adams about how they were moving 4 brass cannon from Boston. On that same February 21st, on the evening probably, General Gage suddenly had a lot more information to write in his intelligence notes. He knew which blacksmiths were making gun carriages for the provincial army, what towns those guns were being stored in. In all, Gage soon wrote, there are in the country 38 field pieces and 19 companies of artillery. General Gage had made a deal for information with Dr. Church. We don't have an authentic picture of Dr. Church, so I'm showing a bit of a ciphered letter that he sent to a British Army officer later in 1775. Thanks to Dr. Church, Gage knew that most of the provincial Congress's guns were at Worcester, a few at Concord, a few at Watertown, and some in Salem, including pieces of brass cannon. So the general made some new plans. Back in January, Gage had asked Army officers who was capable of taking sketches of a country, and they asked them to contact his office. On February 2nd, the day after receiving his first intelligence from Dr. Church, the general wrote out instruction for two officers who had come forward, Captain William Brown of the 52nd Regiment and Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th. Those men were to hike out into the Massachusetts countryside in civilian clothing as far as Worcester County in the center of the colony, taking notes on roads, towns, passes, fords, and other geographic features. Gage told Brown and de Bernier that he expected to have occasion to march troops through the country the ensuing spring. The two officers left Boston on February 23rd with a servant, probably an enlisted man. By midday, they had gotten far as a town called Watertown. And during their midday dinner there, a Black woman who was waiting on told them that she recognized them as having come from the army. So the officers' cover was blown. But they understood that their orders were it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester, where the Patriots were collecting most of their military supplies. So they continued west. Meanwhile, the Provincial Congress's Committee of Safety and Supplies had a long meeting, and General Gage soon received more information from Dr. Church. In particular, the physician relayed, there are 8 field pieces in an old store or barn near the landing place at Salem. They are to be removed in a few days. The seizure of them would greatly disconcert their schemes. Gage had already heard about brass field pieces in Salem. He probably knew from Major Paddock, the commander of the Boston militia train, that the co-founder of that unit, a painter named David Mason, had moved to Salem. And indeed, David Mason, shown here, was the man who had collected those cannon in Salem. He had been secretly working for the Massachusetts Provincial Congress since November. In February 1775, Mason had left most of the cannon he had collected in the North Salem shop of a blacksmith named Robert Foster, who was making carriages for them. The day after hearing that those cannon would soon be removed, General Gage ordered an expedition to seize them. Late on Saturday, February 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and 240 men sailed from Castle William in Boston Harbor. The Army even detained 3 civilians who happened to be on that island to make sure they couldn't tell anyone inside Boston about those troops mobilizing. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie's ship docked in Marblehead early on the morning of Sunday, February 26th. The soldiers reportedly stayed below decks until most of the townspeople had gone into their meeting houses and churches. And then the troops disembarked, formed into their companies, and started to march toward Salem, the next town in. David Mason was attending services when someone ran into his meeting house with the news that British soldiers were on their way. So he raced out to Foster's shop. To reach that shop required crossing a drawbridge over a tributary that fed into the North River. Mason and his friends started to move the cannon out of the forge to a wooded area about 3/4 of a mile further on, and they pulled up the drawbridge. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, guided by local loyalists. They could see the smithy they were supposed to search, but they couldn't get across the water. Leslie yelled for the men on the other side to let the bridge down. Mason and Foster refused. Leslie wondered aloud about ordering his troops to fire. A militia captain warned that he had no legal authority to do that. Some soldiers moved toward 2 gondolas on the riverbank, but locals jumped in to scuttle those boats with axes. Then that scuffling even drew a tiny bit of blood. Mason was yelling from the other side of the river that expresses had gone out, and in a few hours 1,000 militiamen would be on the ground to resist. and Leslie shouted back that he had to follow his orders, insisted he would go over the bridge before he returned if it were a month of waiting first. After nearly 90 minutes, with the sun going down, the Reverend Thomas Barnard, minister of a nearby meeting house, negotiated a compromise. Mason, knowing that most of his cannon had now been trucked away, would let down the bridge. Leslie pledged his honor he would not march above 30 rods beyond it and then immediately return. He would not look for cannon nearby, but he would carry out the letter of his orders to go to this forge. And under that compromise, the men of the 64th Regiment stepped across the channel and then turned back and marched to their ship in Marblehead. Militia companies from nearby towns watched them from a distance. At that time, a single angry or accidental gunshot could have started the war. But again, nothing happened, nobody died, there was no war. In his report to Lord Dartmouth, General Gage acknowledged some embarrassment about how the Salem expedition had panned out. The circumstance of the 8 field pieces at Salem led us into a mistake for supposing them to be brass guns brought in from Holland or some of the foreign islands, which report had also given reason to suspect. In fact, there's nothing in General Gage's intelligence papers to suggest that he had received a hint that the Salem cannon had been smuggled in from overseas. But saying he was going after smuggled cannon wouldn't raise questions in London. Saying he was trying to retrieve brass cannons stolen from Boston would. In the end, Gage insisted the Patriots had secured only some old ship guns which had been carried away from Salem some time ago. On March 3rd, a week later, the local Essex Gazette newspaper told a different story. 27 pieces of cannon were removed out of this town in order to be out of the way of robbers. Meanwhile, Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier, remember them? They were still trying to carry out their orders in central Massachusetts. On the evening after the stalemate in Salem, the two men came into a tavern where those officers were staying in Worcester and told the landlord that they knew those strangers were officers of the army. Brown and de Bernier left Worcester the next morning. They stumbled across a militia drill in a town called Framingham, then headed north to another town called Marlborough, where a loyalist let them in. That loyalist was named Henry Barnes. He told the officers that they were very well known, he was afraid, by the townspeople. In fact, a party of Liberty people had been looking for them the night before. A few years before, Barnes's neighbors had warned him against cooperating with royal authorities by putting a tarred and feathered dummy on his horse. So he had a good reason to be nervous. And after only 20 minutes, Barnes asked those officers to leave, and they trudged east through a snowstorm and eventually made it back to Boston. But General Gage still didn't give up. He developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside. Now, after so many years of study, still have not been able to identify this person. But that person, he or she, wrote from Concord, usually in terrible French. That spy probably chose French because only a small fraction of New Englanders could read it. He or she didn't write idiomatically. It was mostly English syntax translated word for word into French. Fortunately, after 7 years of study, I speak terrible French, so I could read those reports easily. As of March 8th, that spy sent a message to General Gage from Concord saying, 4 brass cannon and 2 cohorns or mortars, so called by the peasantry, concealed at Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel, supposed to be deposited in his cellar. Those were the guns from Boston, the 4 brass cannon. In addition, Concord had 2 pieces of iron ordnance mounted on carriages said to be very indifferent in the courthouse, and 8 more pieces of iron ordnance brought that day from another town. Concord's new colonel, in charge of the town's new Minutemen and its new cannon, was James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and representative to the provincial Congress. And this is his house. That spy also reported on which Concord families were storing gunpowder, small arms, flour, and food for the provincial military. On March 11th, the same spy reported on a trip to Worcester and what artillery was evident there, but that report ended. The brass cannon, which formerly were in the hands of Mr. Paddock, veritably are now at Concord. Having received this report, General Gage ordered Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier back out. They hiked to Concord in disguise on March 20th to poke around for the hidden weapons. Between their own observations and loyalist reports, the officers confirmed that the town had 14 pieces of cannon, 10 of iron and 4 brass, and 2 cohorts. Their iron cannon they kept in a house in town. Their brass they had concealed in some place behind the town in a wood. The officers also brought back their host, a loyalist lawyer, because his neighbors had warned him they would not let him go out of town alive for helping the governor. On April 8th, General Gage took steps to avoid losing any more cannon as at Portsmouth. He sent a small force by ship to secure all the artillery and spare arms at Fort Pownall in Penobscot Bay, now in Maine. Unfortunately for Gage, he had already lost the confidence of the British government ministers in London. General Gage's dispatches in September 1774 describing the uprising in Massachusetts, suggesting that the government suspend the coercive acts, they had arrived in November, but Prime Minister Lord North told men in London that he did not know what General Gage meant by suspending the acts. There was no suspending an act of parliament. And he also doubted the governor was facing bodies of people actually in arms and thus a military foe. He thought that the opposition was merely mobs. Undersecretary of State William Knox later wrote that the September proposals were what turned us all so much against Gage. In March, General Gage received a letter from Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State, suggesting that he recover into the king's possession those cannon and stores which have been taken away in so extraordinary a manner from the fort at Newport in Rhode Island. The general was having enough trouble recovering the cannon taken away from Boston, which he still hadn't told anyone in London about. And now London wanted him to find a cannon that had been taken away from a neighboring colony. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from London written at the end of January. Lord Dartmouth did not merely authorize military action against the rebellion, he told the general that he had to act. The ministry specified that the first and essential step would be to arrest all the principal actors and abettors in the provincial congress, even if such a proceeding should be, according to your own idea of it, a signal for hostilities. So arrest the leaders, even if it brings on war. But Gage didn't move to arrest anyone. His intelligence files and his orders show that he was almost completely focused on Concord and the guns stolen from Boston. Both the Concord spy and Dr. Church were in that town in early April, where the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was meeting. They were sending details to Gage about military preparations. The Concord spy again confirmed that Barrett's house was where the brass cannon are still hidden. Seizing the field pieces at Barrett's farm would require a march deep into hostile territory, 17 miles to Concord and another 2 across the North Bridge. Each of those miles meant the troops would be more tired. Every quarter hour the men spent searching would leave them more exposed. But if that mission succeeded, it would erase the shame of having let those guns get away from Boston in the first place. When General Gage wrote out his first draft of orders for Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, the top item he wanted the soldiers to look for were 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars or cohorns in the cellar or outhouses of Mr. Barrett, a little on the other side of the bridge. Already, however, James Barrett and his family had started moving the most important military supplies to neighboring towns and hiding the rest. Sometime on April 18th, General Gage even received word that the military stores are removed, the field pieces, 4 excepted, which are now in Concord Townhouse. Were those 4 field pieces remaining in Concord the guns from Boston? General Gage revised his instructions for Lieutenant Colonel Smith to be less specific about where to find things. He still hoped the troops would find artillery, and he wrote, "If you meet with any brass artillery, you will order their muzzles to be beat in so as to render them useless." So he was still hoping his soldiers would find the guns from Boston. Gage also took a lesson from the Salem expedition by trying to stop the Patriots from sending messengers ahead of his troops and giving the men in Concord time to prepare. He had mounted officers ride out on April 18th to patrol the roads between Cambridge and Concord and to stop all messengers. Ironically, those riders were what alerted many locals that something was up. In Lexington, a small town on the road to Concord, militiamen saw those officers and started to gather. After sunset on April 18th, 1775, about 800 British soldiers were rowed quietly out of Boston on their way to Concord. And that was more than twice as many as went to Charlestown in September 1774 or Salem in February 1775. But those soldiers were too late to catch those cannon from Boston. And on the road to Concord, those British soldiers would come across the Lexington Militia Company lined up on their common, having been alerted by the riders going through their town. And there would be an exchange of fire, there would be people killed, and a war would begin. And that is why I say that the 4 stolen cannon from Boston were what ignited the Revolutionary War. Now, I am happy to take questions either tonight or through my website here or Twitter. I just as a coda for people who are visiting Boston, you can actually see 2 of the 4 cannon that were stolen because they are on display in national parks. In the 1780s, Secretary of War Henry Knox had those guns engraved with the names Adams and Hancock to honor Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who also happened to be in Lexington at the start of the British March. And today the Hancock is on display at the Concord Visitor Center of the Minuteman National Historical Park overlooking the North Bridge. And the Adams cannon was mounted for many years in the chamber at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument, where it was somewhat exposed to the elements and the public. And a few years ago, the National Park Service conserved it and put it on display down in the visitor center. So it is much easier to visit if you're interested. And I heartily recommend coming to the national parks in and around Boston and enjoying the relics of the first day of the American Revolution. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Well, thank you very much. Terrific presentation. And if folks have a question, they can put it in the Q&A box and we'll pass it on. And I think I'll get the ball rolling. If you would, could you tell us a little bit about why cannon were so important, that they were going to such great lengths to acquire, hide, and find these cannon?
In the battles that they were preparing for, these cannon could be maneuvered around, and with a canister shot, grape shot, or other shot that was made up of basically lots of little pieces of metal, you could really wipe out an entire company if they were unlucky enough to be in front of the cannon. So that was a very powerful, effective way for an army to protect its own men and keep the enemy at bay. One of the things that the provincials discovered during the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th is that they were really doing a lot of damage against the British column in its withdrawal from Concord to Lexington, because in that period it was musket companies against musket companies. But once the British withdrawing reached Lexington, they met up with the reinforcement column that had come out of Boston that morning, and that reinforcement column included some artillery pieces. And so for the rest of the withdrawal from Lexington through Cambridge to Charlestown, the reinforcement company under Colonel Percy was able to keep most of the Americans or provincials at a distance. Most of the provincial casualties took place in that time, and the British soldiers were much better protected. So April 19th itself shows how much more effective cannon were than simply massed infantry, the major tactic. One of the interesting questions, which I haven't really been able to answer, is why, when the provincial Congress had spent months and months and hundreds of pounds, or at least hundreds of pounds of credit, preparing collecting cannon, preparing it, mounting them, why they didn't deploy any of those cannon on April 19th. And I think it's quite possible that the cannon were not quite ready. that, if you had a cannon that's 95% ready, you can feel pretty good about yourself, except if it needs to be 100% ready, then it might as well not be ready at all.
Okay. So we have one question from Robert Wong about the primary goal of the British is to get the 4-brass cannon. He's also been told that Paul Revere was sent by Joseph Warren also to warn both Adams and Hancock from being captured, and was wondering if that is correct.
Yes, Bob, that is correct. The primary mission that Dr. Joseph Warren had for William Dawes and then for Paul Revere on the night of April 18th, 1775, was to ride to Lexington and warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that they were in danger of being arrested. And that's because I think the provincials had very good intelligence of what was in the orders from Lord Dartmouth. Remember, Lord Dartmouth told General Gage that the first thing you do is you should arrest the leaders. So who were the leaders? Well, they were Samuel Adams and John Hancock. They were already taking care to stay outside of Boston so they wouldn't be arrested. So it would make, it was the logical thing to do to send them warning that troops were on their way. However, as a result, American historians have always written about the idea that the British mission was to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. In fact, there is nothing in General Gage's orders for that day about those two men. There is nothing in his intelligence files saying that he was tracking where those men or other leaders were. He certainly didn't arrest Dr. Joseph Warren, who was in Boston at the time. And if he had arrested Warren, he might have actually been more effective than what happened. So it is, it was Revere and Dawes themselves who took it upon themselves after warning Adams and Hancock that they said, oh, maybe the British were also going to Concord. We should go to Concord and warn them. So they were taking their own initiative. They were going beyond the orders that they had received from Dr. Joseph Warren in going on to Concord. And as it turned out, neither of them made it all the way there. Those mounted officers that General Gage had sent out to patrol the roads stopped them. And luckily they had come across another man, Dr. Samuel Prescott, who knew the roads better, was able to evade the officers and get all the way to Concord. Now, I'm not certain that Paul Revere's ride and William Dawes's ride and even Dr. Samuel Prescott's ride made that much of a difference on April 19th, because what happened when the British soldiers did get to Concord is that the Concord militiamen were already ready for them, but they didn't confront them. They turned around and marched away and watched from a distance as the British soldiers spread out through town and started their search. And it took hours of waiting before the shooting at the North Bridge. And then there was another hour or so before they really started to attack the column. So it wasn't like, oh, if Paul Revere and then Samuel Prescott hadn't arrived in just the moment they did, there would be, in fact, it took us hours and hours of just standing around when the news could have spread anyway. As I say, I think the most important riders that went out on April 18th were not Revere and Dawes, but actually those British mounted officers, because they alerted more of the countryside that something was up than, and they alerted it earlier, so that by the time Revere got to Lexington, the Lexington militia was already mobilizing.
All right. I would say hurry up and wait is certainly a familiar story to a lot of soldiers.
Yeah, that's one great way to tell the authenticity of a story or a diary or something, a source from this. If there's just a lot of marching there, nothing happening, that's authentic.
So, Mr. William Barr, it says that in most of his sources, he finds Gage described in neutral or favorable terms, but he points out that the History Channel series Sons of Liberty has George Washington describing Gage in very dark terms, brutal being one of the words. Was there any basis for this disparagement of Gage's character?
I think that Gage was in an impossible situation. And in a way, he put himself into that situation by making promises to the king that he was not able to carry out. But he he was lambasted after the battle for being brutal, because there was a battle and people were killed and property was destroyed, and naturally the locals were upset about that. He has also been criticized by historians for being too cautious. And yet he was the one who was telling London, this is the real situation. This is the real level of opposition. You have to do something about it. And London was the one saying, oh, poo-poo, nothing. So I think Gage he found himself in a position that he did not have the resources to address. He did the best that he could. I think that he was, covering himself by not telling London about the cannon being stolen under his nose. And I think that in part his motivation for his orders in April 1775 were to try to protect his career. As it turned out, the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill sort of ended his career. He never had another command in the British Army. He had to retire to his family estate in England. But he did have the satisfaction over the next few years of seeing that nobody else did any better job in North America than he had.
Right. Both Tom McAndrew and Ken Myers were inquiring, do we know what happened with the other two brass cannon?
I would love to know what happened to the other two brass cannon. We do not. When those two that survive were returned to Boston, one of the Boston newspapers said that the others had been captured and then recaptured, and there was all this great story, which we'll tell you about in our next issue. And then the next issue doesn't say a word. It's so frustrating. We know that by that point they were thought to have been lost to the Americans. But what happened to them when that happened, I don't know. It is very hard from the sources I've seen to track individual American guns during the war.
All right. Nathan Wells was asking, while we know that some artillery units, such as Henry Knox's, were comparatively well trained, how much training did militia artillerymen undergo? He notes that firing the cannon would alert the British forces to their position.
The militia company of artillery in Boston under Major Adno Paddock was thought to be very well trained. In the late 1760s, a British Royal Artillery unit ended up spending the winter at that harbor in Boston, at that fort in Boston Harbor, Castle William, and Major Paddock, who was then, I think, Captain Paddock, took advantage of that and had his men train with professionals, with the Royal Artillery. So they were thought to be quite good. There was a man in charge of the Massachusetts artillery on the second day of the war named Richard Gridley, and he had experience in the King George's War when Massachusetts captured the fort at Louisburg, and then in the French and Indian War, and he actually was receiving a half-pay pension from the British Crown as if he were a retired British officer. That was how respected he was. So there were people in the colonies who were seen as well-trained artillerists. There weren't that many, and the real holdup was the level, the quality of the guns, the quality of the mounting, the carriages. Everyone who saw the carriages that the provincials were using during the siege of Boston talked about them as being indifferent or very poor. I mean, there were even Frenchmen who were observing this and saying they're so that was the real drawback. Eventually, Henry Knox is an interesting example because, as far as I can tell, he was known in Boston before the war. He was an officer in the Grenadier Company, not in the Artillery Company. He was nevertheless quite successful as an artillery officer, I think because he was very good at logistics and at interpersonal relationships and making sure the men and his commander were satisfied. And he was just an excellent military administrator.
Okay. There's a question from David Willman about how easy it was for citizens to identify who were loyalists and who were the revolutionaries. So I guess the question is how out in the open were people about this?
That is a good question. And I think that part of it is, part of the answer is that these were really small towns. Boston was only 16,000 people in this period. And it was the largest town. I mean, it was the third largest settlement in British North America. So a place like Cambridge or Concord was only a couple thousand, and a town like Lexington was a few hundred. So you knew everybody. And in the debates that had been leading up to it, you knew who was sort of lukewarm and who didn't think there should be a committee of correspondence and so on. So it was, I don't think there was a lot of, for most people, you knew where they stood. Furthermore, for most people in Massachusetts, especially rural Massachusetts after September 1774, it was really, really united against the Crown measures. Maybe they weren't clear on whether they should go for an independent republic or autonomy or going back to the old charter or all these other things, but there were very few loyalists, open loyalists in the countryside after that time. A person like Dr. Benjamin Church, the man who was at the same time, both one of the top, 6 organizers, political organizers of the Boston Whigs, and after February 1775, the top informant for General Gage. Well, he was very unusual. He was a true traitor to the cause. And if Benedict Arnold had not come along, we would be using the name Benjamin Church the way we use Benedict Arnold as a synonym for traitor.
All right. Robert Wong asked, what did William Dawes and Samuel Prescott do after their famous ride?
William Dawes, he managed to avoid the British patrol that night, unlike Revere, who was actually captured. And he rode off towards down a road and spotted an inn or something, a sort of driveway, and so he pulled into it and was yelling out as he was being chased by the British officer, "I've got 2 of them behind me for you!" And the officer heard this and thought, "Oh, it's an ambush," and they pulled back and he escaped. I read that story in a family memoir, and I thought, oh, that's the type of story that Grandpa tells when he's trying to be clever and funny, and the grandchildren believe it. And then I found that same story in a newspaper in 1775. So William Dawes really did tell that story right after it happened. As far as we know, we don't know what William Dawes did the rest of that night or the next couple of days. We do know that eventually he was he continued to be in the Patriot movement. He was a militia officer. He was a commissary. There is a story of him when he was living out in Worcester, getting upset at the Convention Army, the British POWs being marched back from the Battle of Saratoga. And so he continued, as he was before the war, to be an activist. Paul Revere, as we know, he continued to be very active, and then eventually was a colonel in charge of the Massachusetts Artillery Company, which attempted to take the fort at Penobscot, and that expedition went terribly in the later years of the war. Dr. Samuel Prescott did not have such a good situation, and he died during the war. And it's only because Paul Revere remembered his name and put it in his report about this event for the Massachusetts Historical Society that we know that Dr. Samuel Prescott was as involved as he was.
All right. John Hodgson was asking if you believe that Gage's choice of a composite force of light infantry and grenadiers for the Concord raid was better choice than a similar sized force of complete regiments?
That is an interesting question. It is sometimes said that by choosing to mix companies from different regiments, that Gage sort of disrupted the standard chain of command, that men did not know who their officers were or where to find their officers, so that there would be a problem. I don't see, I mean, we can't rerun that to know what it had been differently. I think that, in fact, the use of light infantry to move ahead and move quickly, and grenadiers to provide the muscle, I think that was actually a pretty intelligent way of doing it. Using the elite troops does make sense. The places where there was a breakdown in command, where it mattered, on Lexington Common, at the North Bridge, well, those were within companies. There was only one company involved in those. So it was not that their own officers weren't there. It was men responding to what they saw as aggression from the provincial side. Sometimes without orders, sometimes with orders. But it was really on the way back that things started to break down severely for the whole column, and I'm not sure having your own officers and the rest of the infantry with you would have made that any different for those men.
Right. David Sanders would thanks you for your time and sharing your knowledge, and would like to know your opinion about accounts that say General Gage's wife was the one sharing confidential information with Joseph Warren.
This is a theory that has been advanced most prominently in David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride. And he put it simply as a hypothesis, but also really leaned into it. I think that he very much overstates the evidence for it. Some of the quotations he made about it actually refer to another woman. Not the details don't match General Gage's wife, Margaret Kemble Gage. Furthermore, according to Fisher, General Gage sort of broke off relations with Margaret once he realized that she had been Dr. Warren's informant. That he sent her away, and he had very little else to do with her for the rest of their marriage. Well, he did send her away. He sent her out of besieged Boston to England a few weeks before he made the same trip. She was pregnant at the time. It was a besieged city. They were having food shortages. Frankly, if my spouse wanted to send me away from that situation, I would not see that necessarily as an act of rejection. Furthermore, they had another child when they were in England. So their marriage did not seem to break down. There was no evidence from their time that they had this rift. There are people saying that Dr. Warren checked with one more source before sending out Dawes and then Revere. I think that I've been able to put together the sources together to identify that one further source as a British-born knife maker named Jasper, which is just not as dramatic as General Gage's wife. There are also sources which say that General Gage, when he heard that the news of the march had leaked out, he said, "I've only told one other person." And some people interpret that, well, he must have told his wife. But if that's true, that means he didn't tell his adjutant, he didn't tell his military secretary, he didn't tell and I would assume that those were, I mean, we know that people work with confidential information and don't tell their spouses if they're not supposed to, and yet they have to tell their colleagues. So it's much more likely to have been, say, his adjutant, who was, interestingly, Margaret Gage's brother. So if we're going to look at somebody who was American-born and ended up and was close to Gage and privy to information, and in Stephen Kemble's case, ended up living in the United States after the war, as if all that seems suspicious, I think he's more suspicious than his sister.
All right. And Mr. Robert Wong was interested in knowing the bombardment of Charleston and the firing of Charleston. Was that to protect the rear guard of the British, or for some other reason?
Oh, Bob, you're getting ahead of me. the real bombardment, the real attack on Charlestown came during the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that was to protect the British. That was in June, 2 months later, and that was to protect the British landing as the troops tried to take the redoubt behind the town. There was some firing in Charlestown on the night of April 19th, but that was musket firing as the troops came into the town after their very long march, and they were all through from Lexington, but all the way through West Cambridge. They were very worried about attacks from houses very near the road. And so there was a case in Charlestown of soldiers spotting a face looking out of a house near the road and shooting back, and a 14-year-old named Edward Barber was killed that way. But there was not really wholesale damage in Charlestown until June, when the town was burned down.
All right. And also from Robert Wong, to what extent could you identify people's loyalties from the church they attended?
That's a good question. Most of New England was settled by Puritans. Most of the towns had one church, which was a Congregationalist church with Puritan theology in it. And there wasn't a single Puritan theology, or rather the Puritans could argue amongst themselves very well, especially in the New Light versus Old Light controversy of the mid-1700s. So there were some churches, some towns where they had enough people and enough arguments to create two churches, even three. But there was much more religious homogeneity then than now. Boston was unusual. Some of the other port towns like Marblehead were unusual because they had enough of population, enough people from Britain and elsewhere to support congregations of other denominations. So Boston had quite a number of Puritan meeting houses, Congregationalist meeting houses, but it also had 3 Anglican churches, Church of England. It had an old Presbyterian church. It had 2 Baptist churches. It had a Quaker meeting house, and it had a Sandemanian meeting house, which was a sect that really no longer exists. The Sandemanians were actually theologically loyal. They felt that they needed to be loyal to whatever government was instituted at the time. The Quakers were theologically neutral. The Church of England, those members of that church tended to be more loyal than the Congregationalists, but there were Anglicans who were among the Patriot leaders, and there were Congregationalists who were among the Loyalists. So it was an indicator which denomination you belong to, but it was not a strict dividing line.
All right. And that appears to bring us to the end of our questions. So I think we can wait a moment or two more to see if there are any others. But I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank all our questioners for their interesting questions. And John, I want to thank you for your fantastic presentation. So with that, I think we will, a couple of thank yous, Robert Wong and Tom McAndrew. Oh, we do have one more question. We'll take this one. Do you think the fact that Massachusetts had a militia establishment was the main reason why there was a military threat? And I guess that would be to the British. So
everybody, the militia was an institution in the British Empire. There was a militia in England. There was a militia in every state, or every future state, every colony in North America. So having a militia was not unusual for Massachusetts. It was, the standard way for a community to defend themselves against external dangers. So it had been instituted in Massachusetts law for over a century and a half at this point. So the way the militia system worked, I think it worked very well on defense. It was very good at defending. It was not so good at offense. So attempting to use the militia system as a foundation for creating an army, that was a real struggle for the provincials in the first years of the war, because the ideas behind the militia, like short-term enlistments, just did not translate well into attempting an army that was going to attempt to, for instance, attack Canada. You can't attack Canada in winter when everybody has their enlistments up on December 31st. It just doesn't work.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to call it a night. And if you have any questions for John, is there a way they can get in touch with you?
Yes, you're welcome to visit my website, and there is a contacting JL Bell area there. I'm also active on Twitter at Boston 1775. There is a Boston 1775 Facebook page, but I don't understand Facebook, so I don't always know what's going on there. But I'm happy to entertain questions, and I'm very grateful for everybody who's come out, asked such terrific questions. Grateful to Jeff for hosting this event.
All right. Thank you all, and good night.